Hi, everyone. My name is Kieran Maingot. I'm manager of communities here at Tamarack for the climate transitions team. I think I'm in month 2, so still getting to know a lot of the faces that I'm seeing here on today's call, but really excited to be joined today by Aurash Khawarzad for today's conversation. And now just for a little bit of a reflection from myself on both the land that I'm situated on and I think some of the topics today that we are going to be talking about. So I'm joining today as an uninvited white settler and guest on the traditional unceded territories of the Ginegahaga Mohawk Nation. For thousands of years, this land, known as Jajage, or where the group divided or parted ways, colonially known as Montreal, has hosted many Indigenous peoples as a vital territory for meeting and exchange. These lands have strong ties to many Indigenous groups, including the Anishinaabe Nation, who know these lands as Munyang as well. In my preparation for today's conversation, I reflected both on my relationship to the field of planning and cartography and the broader field's relationship to colonization. From my family's historic role in colonial cartography for the French monarchy in Cairi or Ir, colonially named Trinidad, to reflections on how the lands that I now occupy and many of us occupy were colonized and reinscribed new extractive relations, often by using mapping tools and planning processes that allowed them to be divided, sold, and owned. And so I'm really holding these histories and tensions ahead of today's conversations. As well, I really hope that today's conversations can offer a radical vision of resisting sort of these mapping techniques and embracing more expansive and responsible relationships to public spaces and lands, and ones that center Indigenous protocols and resist top-down extractive and private property-centric relations. And so now turning over today's conversation, with the world experiencing rapid urbanization and the need for sustainable, equitable, and community-driven approaches to urban planning, it has never been more critical. Traditional top-down planning models often fall short in meeting the diverse needs and aspirations of communities, and often only lead to or even exacerbate social, economic, and environmental inequalities and inequities. It's essential to really shift towards a more inclusive and participatory planning paradigm that engages community members as active contributors and placemakers of their surrounding environments. And so today's conversation with Aurash is a masterclass to really explore how we can do this in practice. And he has a number of great examples from his own experience and his work that he's done collaboratively that he's going to be able to share with everyone. And so really excited to invite Aurash today into conversation. And I have a short little bio that I'm going to read, and then I'm going to let Aurash take the conversation away. So Aurash is an artist and geographer working and living in New York City. His practice focuses on the democratization of urban planning and the development process. His work uses a combination of research, creative practice, and multidisciplinary collaboration as a means of visioning communities. He's most notably known for creating the Upper Manhattan Project, a model for climate resilient community planning. And most recently, he's worked as a policy coordinator at We Act for Environmental Justice and as a lecturer on urban planning at the New School and City University of New York. Recent projects of his have included the Northern Manhattan Climate Action Plan, Waycount, a tool for community-based transportation planning, and the redevelopment of the 135th Street Marine Waste Transfer Station, among others. So I would love to welcome you today, Aurash, and thank you for joining us today, and it's over to you.
Thank you very much, Kieran. And yeah, thank you everybody for being here. Good afternoon. Glad to be with you virtually, if not in person. And yeah, thank you for that introduction. I'll just go ahead and get started. Let me share my screen. All right, yeah, thank you everybody for being here. And in terms of some of the things that Kieran mentioned have more to do in terms of projects I've worked on, have more to do with planning. And I'd like to address that in the second half of the presentation, but yeah, we're here to talk about cartography and radical cartography, and all of those, of course, like democracy, participation, planning, mapping, cartography, those are all very complex topics that we have to unpack and that we won't be able to do thoroughly in an hour. But what I would like to talk to you about first is thinking about cartography as a tool. I just want to go over maps that I've made that have helped me understand the role of mapping in planning and in engaging with community for the purposes of understanding space, right? And this is really like when we talk about community and democracy, oftentimes we're talking about a geographic place. Sometimes we're not. Sometimes we're talking about communities that expand and include many different places and spaces. But oftentimes we're talking about cities or neighborhoods or, things along those lines. And maps and cartography are tools that help us understand what that means before development happens, during development and after development. And so thinking about cartography is thinking about that, those different aspects of space. And radical cartography, I'll say before going into these examples, is the opposite of what we use maps for in our daily use today. Nowadays, maps are associated with navigation, which is important, or even more so with Google Maps. We get all kinds of information online from maps, and that seems to be how maps are being used. And what I'd like to talk to you about today is how we can introduce a different kind of mapping practice into our own work for the purposes of community planning. That's the emphasis, not necessarily just looking at maps, looking at the archives or looking at Google Maps, certainly not, but thinking about how we can create our own maps, and creating our own maps during a planning process, which is perpetual, right? It's just in different stages. So I want to go over some basic principles with you. And the map that we have here is of Rio de Janeiro. And what I've learned from creating these maps is that as you isolate elements, you're able to understand more. And this is something that you can't do with like a Google Maps, or you can't really, when the more control you have over the process of making a map, the more you're able to tailor it for whatever context you're working in, right? Or whatever it is that you're trying to understand. And that's simply something that you can't do with a Google Maps. Those are proprietary programs. You don't always have the ability to do what you want. So a lot of what I'm showing is bringing in a variety of methods to just experiment, and sometimes you find something that's useful and sometimes you don't. But the purpose here, and I appreciate the land acknowledgement, in the beginning, because a lot of what we're looking at here is about understanding colonialism and what these maps show, but also colonialism is a relationship to the environment. So it's about understanding the environment. Isolating elements reveals patterns. What does that mean? If you look at this map to show you here, if you know what you're looking for, and simply by revealing the green space and by looking at the patterns of buildings, you can understand how development has happened over time and how the landscape has changed over time. And what does that mean? So if you look at this map, you can look, just to point it out, this tree line here is kind of a border between one scale of development and another scale of development. The older scale is the pre-industrial city, right? It's the colonial city, or the medieval city, or what have you. But this is a mixture of different things, right? The industrial development is on a different scale and it looks different. So of course, just by knowing that, you can understand how development has changed over time. How is that relevant here as well? It's relevant here as well because this tree line indicates where the elevation changes are, right? And this is something also when you learn from maps, you can kind of see, well, the newer development in cities is often at a lower elevation, right? If you think about the newer development in the New York or wherever, probably in Toronto or wherever, the waterfront development, right? The waterfront development that goes into the water that's at sea level. Well, now all of a sudden you have an understanding of the risks from sea level rise, right? So I think that this is kind of the point, that by isolating elements, you're able to get a clearer picture of development over time. And that's very relevant to what's happening today, right? So then you also get the understanding of what's happening today. And this map, of course, also this port, and this is also when you understand the colonial history, then you understand the modern environmental landscape too. This section that's highlighted here was the port, Valongo Wharf, and I'm probably not pronouncing that wrong. I'm sorry for any Portuguese speakers, but this port was the port that slaves were brought into, people in bondage were brought into Rio, which was one of the major areas for trade, not trade, but colonialism in the Portuguese Empire. And of course, being a port, it was on the waterfront. Now it's not on the waterfront. So there's another indication of the development, and you can garner this by looking at the map, right? And knowing some of the history. So you know, isolating these elements is a way to understand history and connection with today. And similarly, and this could go on for many different cities, right? This could go on for many different cities. Luanda is a similar thing. Look at the tree line here, and as well where the roads are, the freeways as well. And then you understand where the original waterfront is. And if you look at the old maps, you'll see that the original waterfront is in this area, and this other land is expanded and at a much lower sea level and will be flooded by climate change, right? Because of that. It's more unstable. It's not resilient, if you will. It's not green or sustainable, I guess you could say. And then, of course, also knowing that this is a fort, a Portuguese fort. Luanda is one of the cities that was one of the establishments or colonies. It wasn't the city then, but that was sending Africans in bondage to Rio. But knowing that it's a fort also tells you that it was by the waterfront originally, where the forts were often, for easy access, you know, easy access and defense, right? So think about isolating elements, not just creating a realistic representation of a place when you're creating maps, but really thinking about specific elements and learning lessons from that. And then you can get, you know, taking that notion a step further is something that I did in this map, which was trying to document the original water systems, the hydrology systems of Manhattan or Mannahatta, before colonialism, right? And so it's a similar thinking, trying to trace back, using the maps that we're creating now to try and trace back the history of development in places and to reawaken the indigeneity, you know, of it, and the memory of indigenous communities. Like even just as again, like the statement that was said at the beginning, remembering indigenous or recognizing, acknowledging indigeneity can be thought of. These maps are an extension of that, you know, and a visual representation of that do the work that maps do, right? These continue to work as maps do, but in a different, to create a different history, to present a different history, you know, than the mainstream, than the non-radical cartography, right? So radical cartography, we're isolating elements, we're trying to understand these histories, we're also telling different stories, right? We're telling stories of people who aren't represented in the Western literature about colonialism and, you know, all of that. And then again, these are also the lessons for today, because you can also lay over the data of what are the flooding projections for today, and you see how it correlates with the original water systems. And that's knowledge that can be used for planning, right? That's part of planning, is understanding how these systems work. So it's also working towards that, but an indigenous form of planning, you know, or if not an indigenous form, a sustainable form. You know, this is kind of like, if you think about concepts like degrowth, I think part of that discussion is understanding water and recognizing these systems, you know, and working towards that. And of course, yeah, all the maps you see of New York don't represent, none of if indigenous people are represented, it's through condescension, you know, but like, yeah, we can change the narrative, but only through creating new things, you know, perhaps. And then also, the places that we have now that are still that still have this memory. Xochimilco, many of you know, in outside of Mexico City, maybe within part of it, that is the system, you know, the system of agriculture and transportation and development that existed before the colonization of Mexico. And the question the question is just, what are the indigenous spaces, remaining indigenous spaces that we have? This is one that's well known, and the history of it isn't as well known maybe as it being a tourist destination, right, for entertainment, right? That's how a lot of people think about it now or know of it. But there's this history of, for people who aren't aware, the entirety of the lake that Mexico City was built in was a system of canals and islands. that were used to produce food and to manage transportation, and it was the system of development that existed there. This is what's remaining of it. It's in a very small portion of the city. And these are kind of the remnants, these are the remnants of the pre-colonial urbanism, right? What does indigenous urbanism look like? What does pre-colonial urbanism look like? These are the remnants of it. And how are we telling the story through maps, right? Like that's another version of radical cartography. Understand, documenting the systems that are the ignored and overlooked, and I mean, not ignored by abolitionists, not ignored by many people, but the places that the waste infrastructure and the system of mass incarceration and the things that people don't want to confront all the time or don't want to see in their daily lives when they're implementing their version of an idyllic place, but that are the very harsh realities of how our communities function, right? And to also document the investment. I think these stories, Rikers Island is the prison in New York, and a map is a way of understanding investment, right? A budget is a way of understanding investment, but a map is also a way of understanding investment. And this map I find fascinating because it shows the investment and the level of organization that goes into incarcerating people, that you don't see in many, you can't show me a college campus with this much organization, this level of investment infrastructure it's a city in and of itself, right? It's a city in and of itself, but where are, as when I was doing environmental justice work, it's the first question is, well, where do we know where the waste infrastructure is that's generating so much pollution? Do people know that for the places that they live? Are they aware of this infrastructure that's essential for their daily reproduction and that's killing people, right? Do they know where that is? And same with the prison system, right? Do we know where these things are? And mapping is something that can allow us to do that. And similarly, what stood out to me looking at this prison in Yuma, Arizona, is something you get from mapping and cartography is a sense of scale, right? That's one of the critical aspects of it. And this notion of scale and being able to see patterns as you observe at a bigger scale. And that's understanding development patterns of the world. And we're talking about community planning, right? We're talking about democratization of planning, et cetera. That's creating these patterns, or managing these patterns, governing these patterns, thinking them through. And this map struck me as really important to that, because you see how the prison system is expanding in this kind of pattern basis, similarly to how the suburbs, and this is how I like when you go to an area, we've all been to the peripheries where the infrastructure is developed, but there isn't the development yet. The houses aren't there, but you see the infrastructure, you see the streets, you see the pipes coming out of the ground, you see that they're creating an environment where it's going to be easy to just finish it by building houses, and the infrastructure is already there. And that's kind of what you can see from the prison system. It's kind of what I take away from it, is this infrastructure that's being built to expand, and planning the expansion as a foregone conclusion, as you would with the suburbs, and this is also like, it gives you insight and a window into the zoning practices, right? The zoning practices and how they share there's a similar approach to this style of development. And radical cartography, of course, it's documenting it and then critiquing it, right? Documenting it and critiquing it and being aware, right? Documenting it so that we're aware of what's being done and how so many people are living, right? And I called it grotesque expansions, right? So radical cartography, you have these patterns. Some of those patterns are these grotesque expansions, right? Places where people are suffering, places where pollution is being generated that seem to be going unabated. So I see radical cartography as part of its job as focusing on these because they're not part of the story that's being told through non-radical cartography. Also, and similarly in this vein, thinking about if, you know, on the subject of place and community, um, I started by saying that we often think of community as being a geographic place. Uh, what does that mean for, in today's world, what does it mean for a community to function, to be able to reproduce itself? And it's a global process, you know, because of how goods are manufactured, because of how resources are consumed. Um, no place can be thought of without understanding these connections with the world, you know, and the impact that we're having on other places, as well as the world as a whole, right? And if you think about sustainability, and this is something, you know, maps are often used in sustainability projects to show progress. You know, this solar farm or this wind farm or what have you, it's often maps are a key tool in understanding the green revolution, you know, the green energy revolution. But what you don't see is the global process of planetary extraction, as it's been called. And that's not what the sustainability maps, the sustainability cartography doesn't show the extractive processes that are happening around the world and the socioeconomic inequality that those are creating. This map, this is the world's largest copper mine in Chile, outside of Antofagasta, which is a very large mining city, metropolitan area in the desert, Chilean desert. And this mine gives you a sense of how big it is compared to the cities that are next to it. You know, you can see the grids where there's development, and there's larger cities around to support this. But thinking about for all of us, and this mine supported, we all have materials that have come from these places, right? Because of how dependent we are on digital technology. But there's also distinct patterns and pathways of extraction that exist everywhere. And my question is, you know, if we want to do democratic community planning, isn't it essential to understand the resources that the community is dependent on, and the systems, you know, the systems of logistics, and the system of energy, right? Because this is extraction is for all of these things. And also the system of goods production for economic development, right? We think about jobs, we think about the economy, we think about people earning a wage. That's very heavily intertwined with extraction of resources, you know, as we all know. But the point here being radical cartography is exposing how the green revolution is not green. You know, the green capitalism is not sustainable, because of the impact it has on the environment, and because of how this resource extraction also comes with human exploitation. You know, with we all, and you may have seen the mines that exist, like, and there's people working in very poor conditions all throughout the global south, right? You can say the global south is still being exploited through this process, and at the same time it's being presented as a pathway towards climate sustainability, right? Um and also the tar sands here, and then to give you a sense of the scale, right? To give you a sense of the scale, this you know, these maps, this map of Rio is at the 1 and 3/3500 scale. This is 3,500 times smaller than a 1-to-1 scale. And this map of the tar sands is at the 1 to 300,000 scale. So it shows you how much bigger, right? This is covering, this map is showing a much larger area. These are all large cities, you know, all of these mine extraction sites. You know, and so and of course, like, it's maybe it has a direct, it has a connection with our communities maybe it's not as clear as with the communities that are closer to the site. But because of the system of planetary extraction, we've all become dependent on these large scale mines that exist around the world. If you do the math on transitioning to electrification for the automobile industry, for example, it's staggering how much more mining is necessary to produce the batteries. Not to mention everything else that's going to have batteries and other precious metals and other resources, rare earth minerals, and precious metals. And that's not including the oil and, all the other things that still aren't going away. And the lithium mines as well, which I just mentioned. And again, like it's what qualifies as green, right? I think this is also thinking, radical cartography can help us present a counter argument to sustainability. Lithium, maybe it doesn't have some of the impacts that oil has, but when you do this to entire landscapes, it's going to have some impact, right? So how do we reconcile that? So yeah, getting into now, how much time? Okay, like 5 more minutes, or no, 15 more minutes?
We got about 10 more minutes.
15? Okay. All right, I'll keep it shorter. I'll stop at maybe like 12 or 13. Yeah, so now thinking more about democracy. So I spent the last slides where we were looking at places around the world. I wanted to go over those general principles of radical cartography with you, and just have you thinking about, well, if we're making maps for our community as part of a planning process, how can we employ different tactics? Not every map, not every process calls for a highly quantitative map, that's in the style of like an infographic, if you will. There's other elements that you can look at, history and all kinds of things. But also there's an intersection too of those. And these maps that I'll show just in the next few slides for the remaining are ones that I created for a process in New York, for a planning process in New York. And it is looking at all kinds of data that's available, right? And the other maps I made, they didn't use numerical data. And it's like, you don't want to, in creating maps, they can end up being very big projects. And I encourage anyone who wants to make more maps, don't invest only in large projects where you're dealing with large amounts of data and it's a lot of customization and, sitting in front of a computer and having to, something with a very high learning curve where it may or may not get done. Like the maps I was showing previously, they don't have this level of data as the one that I'm showing here, right? But they're still useful. And it's great to just produce things and iterate as you go, right? And to be able to develop your skills, because this is also a design discipline, right? And that's something I should have said at the beginning that I really find fascinating about cartography, is that it is a combination of all of these different disciplines in thinking about design and research and history, and politics and all of these things. It's a representation of all of that narrative. So maybe if you haven't developed certain design skills that you want or other research skills, those things come along, but you can always engage in one or the other aspects of creating a map. But there is a lot of great information out there. There's a lot of great data out there. I believe the census data less and less nowadays for some reason. I don't know, but but it's still there, right? And it's worth looking at, and you have to take it with a grain of salt, right? But it is there. So just through using data, this map is looking at climate change displacement, and this is also a conversation about planning. Where should planning be prioritized? If we think about just urban planning, we think about supporting marginalized communities. We think about supporting communities on the fringe that are at the greatest risk of suffering, that are suffering the most and at the greatest risk of mortality, right? Often due to systemic reasons, systemic racism, economic, injustice, all of those things, gender discrimination, all of those systems that constitute thinking about justice. But if we're doing planning, how are we making those decisions? How do we make those decisions? Because even among a place like New York, which is the majority Black and brown people, right? So you can't just say, yeah, we're helping Black and brown people, because there's different levels of risk in terms of planning investments that need to be made, right? Because if you're on the waterfront, obviously there's a different risk for you than if you're not. So it's not just about your race. It's about so many other factors that have to be taken into consideration. So how can we use mapping and data to do that? And this map is asking that question. It's saying, where are people paying more than 50% of their rent? Because that constitutes being rent burdened. And there's a greater risk of displacement for people who are rent burdened than for people who are not rent burdened. It's also looking at communities that are in the floodplains, in the storm surge areas. And it's looking at racial demographics, communities of color, and where those elements intersect are compound impacts of risk of displacement, right? Compound impacts of risk of displacement. And from those, this map is trying to determine where the greatest threat of displacement is, right? And putting a number on it, right? Putting a number and putting specific locations on it, because also a lot of times there's a planning process. We know communities that are good at getting funding may not be the communities that are the most at risk, right? A community that may get a grant to do a planning process may not be the community that's at the most at risk. So what tools can we use to say, these are the places that are facing the greatest threat of displacement? And so therefore they need to be prioritized in terms of the investments and planning and, sustainability efforts and things like that. And then through these numbers, there's 500,000 people in these zones that are at extreme risk of displacement in New York from climate change. So that's significant. I don't think that's been done before to really estimate, because it's not in the city's interest to create these maps. Whose interest is it in? It's not, the city's not going to say, maybe in some contexts they might, right? But not in New York. Not in New York, where displacement is such a controversial issue. The city administration is not going to draw attention to this more than it's already being drawn attention to, right? So how can we talk in hard, real terms using maps that highlight this narrative? And this project, this was also, you can kind of see it in this map here for people who aren't familiar. In New York, in Manhattan, all the waste infrastructure is located in West Harlem. And this serves the whole island. That's combined with all of the bus infrastructure, the bus depots. It's combined with natural gas infrastructure, and the waste transfer station. All of these things that if you're on an island, you need all these things just to function, given how places have developed. So We Act is an organization that developed to draw attention to this and to protest as they were installing these things, to protest them and say, you can't put all of this here in one place just because we're Black, basically. It's what is Black and impoverished. And that has led into, many decades of advocating and having a counter planning, right? Radical cartography, you can also think of as supporting counter planning, right? What's the counter planning narrative, and what's the counter plan to this plan to put all the waste infrastructure here, right? The city the city isn't in the business of developing a counter plan to their own plan. So who's in the business of developing the counter plan to the city plan? And my goal with this, and then these red buildings here you can see is all the public housing, not all of it, but public housing, NYCHA in New York City. And there's a reason all of this housing is located in this area. It's because this is one of the last parts to develop in New York because of its flooding that occurred, right? And so it also, when you go back to looking at the original waterways, then you get a sense of the future threat, right? And with climate change, you can estimate, well, okay, like, yeah, this problem needs to be dealt with now, or it's going to get much worse, right? Important for a community planning process. And then this similarly, this was in that project, and radical cartography. It's also, I think, this process of power mapping, right? If you're counter planning and you're developing this vision, first of all, what is the vision, right? What is the vision? And secondly, what's the strategy, right? What's the strategy for implementing that vision? And that's what power mapping is, right? It's highlighting a vision, a goal, and then it's strategizing. And this is also a form of mapping, right? This is also a form of mapping. It's power mapping, right? But also when we attach it to a place, then it becomes geographic mapping, and it becomes cartography. This vision, this came before this book. This book, working with We Act, we developed this. It was over 2 years of workshops and education on what resilience means for this community, right? And this was the vision, and this went through I call this a community vision only because it went through this really extensive process of conversations and ratification, by the community, right? Because if they don't say it's a community vision, it's not a community vision. And then after the vision was created, then the question was, okay, how do we implement the vision? And this book is a guide, like a field guide for that. And this book has many, many maps in it, many, many maps on different subjects. And I wanted to create, and say, okay, well, what if why don't we ever really have the detailed maps just for our community that people can easily access and can be used for research, right? You might go somewhere, the library or whatever resources you have online, and maybe there's a huge data set, right? Like, and maybe if you know how to, you can make maps for your community. But I was working in this process, so it was, and if someone who has the skills is working in the process, then we should try, I think it would be interesting to create just this vast catalog of mapping resources for people that deal with very local issues, very local issues. And that's a resource, right? That's a resource. So that was just that. And then the book, again, it was how to implement this vision, right? Because you create the vision, but then how do you implement it? And mapping is also a part of that if it's a planning project. Yeah, and you can make maps with anything. I think like this is also more now. I like to think about maps can be made with any resources. Maps can be made with any resources. And it's also, I'll end on this. It was 3 topics that I wanted to cover with you. One was the first section, which was methods for radical cartography, just different practices, different theories. The second one was thinking about applying radical cartography for community planning. And that's the New York projects I was just showing you. And then thirdly is radical cartography for creating memories of places, thinking about memory of place and how we understand place. And also a diversity of methods, non-digital methods that anyone can do, and you can use any objects to create maps. You don't have to spend a lot of time on a computer, and I hope that you don't. I hope that you skip that part and just start doing other things. Although sometimes it's useful. I'm not gonna lie. It is. You can cheat if you know how to use the computer, but you don't have to, right? as I've read different books from also my degree, I'm trying to have a better sense of the geographic issues in those books by creating maps as a way, and that's a memory process. That's a memory. It's helping me conceptualize space. I'm reading something, but it's helping me understand the books and these spaces, and also evoking the memory of them, hopefully for other people, right? So it's dealing with like, how do we create memories of place? Maps are memories of places. Whenever you look at a map, like that place is always going to be different than the map because places develop and they change all the time. So it's creating a memory of that place as it was. And so yeah, you can assemble maps out of anything. This was also similarly a map based on the book The Long 20th Century. Those are two great books. The book I just showed, Our History is the Future, or Our History is Our Future by Nick Estes, and The Long 20th Century. This one, I mean, they're pretty academic-y. I don't know if that's your thing, but and in this map, it's showing this book, and the map is about the history of the development of industrialization, I guess you could say, or capitalism, and the rise and fall of world powers, right? Like a very big topic. And the map is of Venice, Genoa, Amsterdam, London, and New York, and how all of these places have connected. And it's about helping me understand the content, right? This was helpful for me. Hopefully, it's also art, and it's interesting for that reason, hopefully. But it also is a process to help me learn based on how my mind works, right? And that's something that many of us don't explore. We're taught that learning happens in specific ways. And I encourage people to explore this spatial process as a method of learning, as a form of pedagogy and learning. Yeah, maybe it might help things stick with you more, and you might understand something a little bit differently than you would have, and hopefully you won't forget like I do with a lot of things, but with these, hopefully I forget a little less, I guess. Yeah, so thank you, everybody. That's it for me, and yeah, I hope to hear your questions, and please feel free to get in touch if you have anything that doesn't get shared today.
Yeah, thank you so much, Aurash. I think I could have listened to you for like another hour, for sure. And I imagine many of us think that as well. Folks, I encourage you all either to jot questions in the chat, or you can raise your hand. We're a small group. We can definitely, I feel like, have a little discussion together as well. So if anyone has any questions, please feel free to use either of those, and we can start that off. I have a few questions myself, so I'm happy to start off that if no one has any to begin. Yeah, so maybe, I mean, I wanted to start off, and I think you started to answer it there, Aurash, a little bit, in terms of talking about getting off the computer and using maybe some non-traditional means of mapping and stuff. I had a question, like, if I was, say, in a group of community members who want to do sort of a mapping project, whether it's a counter mapping project or whatever the aim is and stuff like that. I was curious of, like what tools or methods you might recommend as a good place to start, maybe if we don't have the most, knowledge of cartography, or like we haven't necessarily done like a PhD or anything, but we really recognize the value that this project and process has.
Yeah. Well, I think like if you're working on a project in that context, you're probably not trying to do this crazy, detailed, like highly technical kind of thing, right? And so you don't need that much. Like even thinking about a map, right? It's important that people recognize what it is and where it is. So you're thinking about these boundaries, like what are the boundaries of this place? And what are some of the key places that people are going to recognize, like in Manhattan, it's the island, right? It's the streets, right? Like a lot of cities, you can tell where it is by looking at the streets, because we all have seen this before, right? So that you can do pretty easy. You can trace something, right? You could put it on your TV screen and you can trace it, right? Like you can get like your nephew to help you or something, you know, or the guy, like whoever has this ability. Anyone can do this now, right? You take something and you know how to put it on a screen, on a bigger screen, or even on your computer monitor, right? If you're doing like something smaller, like a handout, then it's a smaller screen. Something bigger, you might need something bigger. But once you kind of have that outline, then you can start working with your hands. You know, then you can start working with your hands. And we've all seen like a stencil, like you're creating kind of a stencil of a place, right? And I'm thinking like something you said, like people want to create a poster or do a mural would be great, or something on the ground, you know, an installation, right? Like, yeah, so you kind of just have the boundary and then you start filling it in. Is like one method that I think people overlook a lot, you know, that I use. Yeah.
So that's great. I actually did. I was at a conference not too long ago where we did an exercise exactly like that, and we went out like on the streets of Montreal, and we like had these very much. We sort of had like the sandbox of a couple streets and stuff like that, and then we just started throwing paint and other things onto it, and we were very much mapping like hostile architecture in Montreal. So very much in line with that.
But I think it also is going to come to, just as you think about what's the story you're trying to tell, that's going to, I think, inform what you're showing and the materials you're using. And like, you know, I think about things in terms, lately I've been thinking a lot about like, I want to use materials that represent a place as well, right? We make a lot of associations, right? And a lot of this is psychological. We make associations through color, through texture, through all the, you know, through shapes, through all of those things. So a map can be anything, right? It can be like we find things in nature that represent places, right? The stars are a map. I mean, that's that exactly. Like if you think about this, like how do we relate to place? Like how do you relate to the place that you're in? And then kind of creating something around that is a map, you know. And yeah, the stars have been used for maps. Materials in place are are a connection to that place that you can then use, and you're creating like a representation, and you're using those materials, you're kind of building a connection. I don't know if that makes sense, but you know, it's interesting to play around with it.
No, for sure. Definitely. I like that. And it feels a lot more expansive. I think we all could do a little bit of expanding what we see as maps and how we can ground them in place. Before I ask another question, Denise, do you want to take it away?
Sure. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt the flow of quite your questions. Just building on the last one that you just asked. I'm curious if you could give us a few more examples, or just tell us a time when you had used, like, can you say a bit more about the use of the maps, the counter maps in advocacy? So I know I've heard some really interesting examples of guerrilla mapping, or for example, where people go out and actually physically change street signs or poster the city with alternative maps. I don't know, do you have any thoughts on how to do that well? I mean, you could sit in a policy planning table with the city or whatever and bring these up as well. But just curious what your experience has been with that side of things. Thanks.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. Yeah, that sounds really cool. I think with stuff like that, you kind of just have to go for it. You know, I don't know. I haven't done that. I haven't done the guerrilla mapping. That's really, I like that idea. But we were thinking about, for us, it was asking the question, well, like, what does sustainability mean for this particular place? You know, and then showing, like, creating materials that are part of the discussion that reflect what people think, right? Like versus obviously when the city, I keep referencing the city, but when institutions or, you know, what have you are publishing material, if it doesn't have that participation, or even if it does, it might not be reflective of it, right? So like for us, it was just about creating materials that get people thinking, and that, I think have some kind of the provocative feel that you're talking about, but at the same time, they're really like saying, well, for us, our priorities are like, here's where the vulnerable, here's how we think about vulnerability. Here's how we think about sustainability. Like, here's the buildings. And then at a very real level, how do we build a sustainable infrastructure, right? It's not going to be, if we're thinking about renewable energy and all of these different technologies, how should it be applied? And it's very much going through and saying at a street level, here's what needs to happen. Here's where the opportunity is, where people want to be involved and have the need and have are in this place that needs the help, right? So like so it could be like for solar, for developing renewable energy projects, that can be that's a key part of the process, like just for that example, right? Like yes, there's going to be investments in solar and whatever it is. That's not as important as how are we making the decisions about where to apply it to make sure that people who are most likely to suffer in a blackout have that energy, right? For example, solar, for example. So it's not really like that. Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
No, I was just gonna say that, does that suggest to me that you're building relationships with the people who have the decision-making power over things like that? Is that part of the process then? Like the city for other institutions?
Yes and no. My opinion is that the city is responsible for public resources, right? Those being accountable to the public. And so you want to leverage those resources. But at the same time, we took the approach that we can't survive, we can't be dependent on the city either, right? And this, particularly with renewable energy, it's a DIY culture, right? Renewable energy is a DIY culture. The first wind turbine in New York City was installed by UHAB residents, which were urban homesteaders in Lower Manhattan who were occupying vacant buildings. And they sued the city to allow for net metering. They sued the state, and that's why net metering exists in New York, right? So these tools can be used by the public, and you want that relationship, maybe you do want that relationship to advocate, right? Because if you don't advocate, then who will? But at the same time, like, why can't we build our own? Why can't we also take action where we can, right? Do what you can, and then what you can't do, you can't, right? But what you can do, you can.
No, I love that idea. Sorry, I was scribbling it down over here because I feel like it really stuck with me. That notion of like really what like community members can do, and also how, I'm constantly reflecting on how, while cities often are like the proprietors or have like leadership roles or like overseeing roles of public spaces, it really is like a public space is ours to make and ours to create and stuff like that. And so groups of community members can certainly always come together and animate them. Is there any last questions? I know we have like 2-3 minutes left. Aurash, do you have any closing comments or remarks before I transition into a little closing reminder for everyone?
I want to thank Brooke for sharing this link and as well the other comments. Thank you so much. Yeah, I want to say thank you. Before I say that, Brooke, this link that you shared regarding the star charts, it shows me like it's really important to have a community of practice, right? To be creating things and to have a culture where you're working together to create things that have meaning for your community, that relate to the spaces that we're in. And so it's not about replicating anything that's happened anywhere else, but developing this process that's going to be meaningful for you, right? And help you understand the place that you're in. And I also just lastly want to say thank you for having this discussion. And thank you so much. I hope to hear from you in the future.
Yeah, thank you so much, Aurash. Yeah, thank you all for being in conversation today. And I just wanted to close us off with a little reminder that from the Community Climate Transitions team here at Tamarack, we do have our national gathering coming up in November. It's virtual from November 14th to 15th, and registration is now open. Please feel free to save your seat, and we have lots of great speakers that'll be coming online, and we're releasing those over the next couple of weeks and already have a good lineup already out. But as always, if there's anything you need, you can always feel free to reach out to me, and we will be sending a follow-up email likely next week with all of the goodies that were shared today. Thank you again for everyone's questions and everything that they've contributed to the conversation. And of course, Aurash, thank you for all of the wisdom you shared with us.